you ever dreamed of exploring another world? Could you witness something new? Push boundaries? Or reach for your greatest hope? The experience of every generation is yours. On the History Channel, where the past comes alive.
Kashmir is a breathtakingly beautiful country in the foothills of the high Himalayas. Its crisp, cool air and abundance of lakes and clear streams have long made the mountain kingdom a welcome retreat from the oppressive heat of the Indian plains. But Kashmir's critical position, surrounded by Pakistan, India, China, and Afghanistan, made its ownership a source of bitter conflict and rivalry between India and Pakistan, which has existed since Britain granted both countries independence in 1947. Thousands of people died on both sides when India and Pakistan went to war over Kashmir in 1947, 1965, and 1971. Since then, many more have suffered in outbreaks of violence, despite international pressure for a peaceful settlement. The root of the problem can be traced back to the build-up to independence when Lord Louis Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, wavered over whether Kashmir should be ceded to India or Pakistan, following division into two separate self-governing sovereign states. By failing to make up his mind one way or another when he had power, Mountbatten committed a blunder which plunged the entire region into endless chaos. He was under enormous pressure from Jawaharlal Nehru, soon to be India's first Prime Minister, to place Kashmir under his control. To Nehru, it was unthinkable that Kashmir, the home of his ancestors, should go to Pakistan. Meanwhile, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founding father of Pakistan, was arguing just as persuasively that Kashmir, with a Muslim majority, rightfully belonged to Pakistan, even though Kashmir's ruler at the time, Maharaja Hari Singh, was a Hindu. Mountbatten was in a terrible quandary, so he chose to do nothing. At the time, he had no idea that his failure to confront the problem would have such tragic and far-reaching consequences. His indecision let Hari Singh believe that he could continue to rule Kashmir as a sovereign state, free from both India and Pakistan, as soon as the British left. However, this illusion was shattered when, towards the end of October 1947, Kashmir was overrun with an army of Pathans, fierce tribesmen from the northwest frontier of Pakistan. Hari Singh panicked. Thinking this was the prelude to a full-scale invasion by Pakistan, he decided that Kashmir's future would be best served by handing the state over to India. Nehru accepted Hari Singh's offer with enthusiasm, and Indian troops poured into Kashmir to drive out the Pathans. Kashmir was now part of India. Pakistan violently objected, and a state of war was declared between the two countries. Mountbatten's disastrous misstep had cast a long shadow over the region, which exists to this day. Lord Louis Mountbatten, a member of the British royal family and a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, was appointed the last Viceroy of India in February 1947. He was to oversee the transfer of power and negotiate a peaceful and acceptable settlement between India and Pakistan. Mountbatten replaced Field Marshal Sir Archibald Wavell, who had been Viceroy since 1943. Wavell was a professional soldier and the wartime commander of the Indian Army. It had been obvious for some time that independence was inevitable and that the future of this huge country now lay in the hands of Nehru, Jinnah, and the peacemaker Mahatma Gandhi. Both Hindus and Muslims in India demanded their freedom from British rule. There were daily demonstrations, many of them violent. The United States was urging Britain to grant India independence as soon as possible. The newly formed United Nations pressed them as well. The catalyst was the landslide election victory of the British Labour Party in July 1945, headed by Clement Attlee. World War II was in its closing weeks, and Attlee knew Britain could no longer afford to maintain an overseas empire. He was determined to free India as soon as possible. With this decision, Attlee had no idea of the bloodshed which was to follow in India, or the fact that the blunder over Kashmir would reverberate decades later. On March 23, 1946, a high-level British government mission arrived in New Delhi to settle the terms of independence with India's leaders. At this stage, Britain was not prepared to entertain the idea of partitioning. Attlee was determined India would remain united no matter what difficulties might lie ahead. Despite the continuing efforts of Gandhi to keep the peace, the split between Hindus and Muslims grew deeper. The Hindus wanted total control of the entire subcontinent, but the Muslims argued passionately for their own state, Pakistan. They felt that if Pakistan remained part of India, they would be no more than a powerless minority, swamped by the overwhelming mass of Hindus. At this point, no one gave a second thought to Kashmir and the terrible problems partitioning would cause for the mountain state. India's ruling body, the National Congress, was dominated by Nehru, a disciple of Gandhi who had been educated in England. Nehru was a modernist and a true democrat. He wanted India to develop into one of the world's leading nations, despite the racial and religious differences of its people. Jinnah, Nehru's arch-rival and leader of the Muslim League, was equally tenacious and just as politically skilled. He had been dubious at first about the viability of Pakistan as a separate state. But by the time Mountbatten arrived, Jinnah was convinced partition was the only way to safeguard Muslim interests. Since Mountbatten seemed incapable of taking a firm stand on the issue, a compromise between Nehru and Jinnah was doomed to fail. The increasing hatred between India's Hindus and Muslims reached a violent climax in the summer of 1946, the year before independence. More than 20,000 people died in a series of bloody clashes. In late November, Attlee summoned India's leaders to London. He was desperately trying to bring the warring factions together before the final transfer of power. But the conference ended in disagreement. Kashmir was barely mentioned. Wavell, still viceroy at the time, was dismayed. He suggested that Britain should retreat from India and leave the people there to sort it out for themselves, including the disputed ownership of Kashmir. This was flatly rejected. Meanwhile, the bloodshed and violence continued. Death and destruction was paving the road to independence. In February 1947, Wavell was replaced as viceroy by Lord Louis Mountbatten, the supreme Allied commander in Southeast Asia at the end of World War II. Mountbatten was extremely reluctant to take the post, accepting it only when he could have the power to make decisions without London's approval. Upon arriving, Mountbatten and his wife, Lady Edwina, were shocked by the abject poverty and suffering they found. The appointment of Mountbatten did little to still the restlessness of India's vast and seething population. As far as most of them were concerned, he was there merely to hand over the reins of power, not dictate their future. Mountbatten witnessed firsthand how India was tearing itself apart with hatred and shocking violence. He had no idea that his forthcoming indecision over Kashmir would condemn the country to a state of almost perpetual warfare. In an attempt to halt the bloodshed, Mountbatten informed India's politicians that he had decided to bring the date of independence forward from June 1948 to mid-August 1947. He also told them that partition to create the separate states of India and Pakistan seemed the only way to guarantee a peaceful future for the region. As the day of independence dawned for India and Pakistan, there were more than 70 million frightened refugees, both Hindus and Muslims, crossing and recrossing the new boundaries in a desperate search for a safe haven. It was one of the greatest migrations ever seen anywhere. Meanwhile, Hari Singh, the Maharaja of Kashmir, watched the political winds blow from his peaceful mountain kingdom. He feared that the violence would cross over his borders. On August 14, 1947, the people of India and Pakistan put aside their hostilities and celebrated their long-sought independence after 200 years of British rule. The happiness was short-lived. Overcrowded refugee trains were being attacked with sickening violence. The death toll was rising relentlessly, and no one seemed able to prevent it. A small British force on the border was unable to manage. They were quickly withdrawn, and India and Pakistan were left on their own. Then the nightmare of Kashmir began. In the weeks following independence, a frenzy of violence continued unchecked across India. It was not until late October that it began to subside. By now, Hindus and Muslims alike were sickened by what they appeared to be doing to each other. Then Hari Singh, the Maharaja of Kashmir, faced with a Pathan invasion, decided he would prefer Indian rule over Pakistani. Hari Singh was a spoiled and impulsive prince, a high-caste Brahmin Hindu presiding over 4 million people, 3/4 of whom were Muslim. Self-indulgent and somewhat immoral, he hardly paid attention to his subjects. After independence, Hari Singh was one of only 3 Indian princes out of 600 who were allowed to remain on their thrones. They also maintained their armies, although they were poorly equipped. The tranquility of Kashmir was shattered on October 24, 1947, when a Pathan army swarmed in from the northwest frontier and put an end to Hari Singh's corrupt rule. 2 months earlier, Ali Jinnah, exhausted by his duties as leader of Pakistan, had wanted a short break in Kashmir. To his astonishment, Hari Singh refused his request. Pakistan decided to encourage a Pathan invasion. The tribesmen would be rewarded with wholesale looting and plunder. Kashmir would then become part of Pakistan. The main force of Pathans followed a smaller advance unit, which overwhelmed and swept aside Hari Singh's woefully inadequate army. Jinnah knew that if Pakistan attempted a full-scale invasion of Kashmir, a war with India would be inevitable. He tried to obtain it by stealth. Just before midnight on October 25th, Hari Singh slipped quietly out of Srinagar. The Pathans were only 35 miles away, and he did not want to be around when they stormed the city. The commander-in-chief of the Indian Army, Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck, wanted to send a brigade to Srinagar to protect the British residents there. But Mountbatten, who was now Governor-General of India, denied the request. By now, Hari Singh had escaped from the battleground around Srinagar and was making his way north to Jammu, a mainly Hindu province of Kashmir. He sought safety in his winter palace, where he wandered the halls with gloom. He knew his days as Maharaja were over. His palace at Srinagar now lay abandoned, at the mercy of the Pathans. Mountbatten changed his mind and sent airborne troops to the Srinagar airport. Their orders were to hold it against the Pathans until ground reinforcements arrived. However, once Attlee discovered what Mountbatten was doing, he ordered a halt to the airlift. He did not want any British involvement in Kashmir's troubles. On October 26th, VP Menon, a powerful and influential member of the Indian administration, arrived in Jammu. By midnight, he had persuaded Hari Singh to sign a document which ceded Kashmir to India. It was either that or be taken over by Pakistan. The next day, India dispatched the first of what was to be a 100,000-man army to Kashmir. They quickly routed the disorganized Pathans and drove them back across the border into their own territory. A short time later, a delighted Nehru made a triumphant return to Kashmir, the land of his ancestors. Jinnah was furious, but powerless to intervene. Pakistan, however, refused to accept that Kashmir was now part of India. Towards the end of 1947, hostilities broke out along the Kashmir border, ending only with the intervention of the United Nations and a ceasefire which came into effect in January 1949. At the same time, the UN passed a resolution ordering both Indian and Pakistani troops to withdraw from Kashmir. The UN also insisted on a plebiscite, which would give the people of Kashmir the right to decide whether they wanted to belong to India or Pakistan. India, insisting that Kashmir had been legally ceded by Hari Singh, immediately raised objections. To this day, the 1948 resolution has yet to be fully implemented. Tension between India and Pakistan over Kashmir spilled over into full-scale military confrontation in 1965 and again in 1971. In 1972, under the Simla Accord, India and Pakistan agreed to divide Kashmir. However, in 1988, Pakistan reneged on the agreement, saying it had been signed under duress. Since then, India and Pakistan have engaged in a number of bloody encounters over Kashmir. Today, with each country equipped with nuclear weapons, full-out war would be unthinkable. Internally, Kashmir continues to be fractured by strife as various factions within the country battle for control. It is estimated that more than 50,000 Kashmiris have died since 1990 as guerrilla groups harass communities and commit atrocities. In 1947, Mountbatten could have had no idea that his failure to make a firm decision over the future of Kashmir would have such momentous and far-reaching consequences. Nonetheless, it was a tragic blunder, no matter how unintentional, that haunts the subcontinent to this day.